Mm, so for the second speaker of today, yeah, he's famous too. It's the Canadian folklorist John BODNER, who works at the Department of Social and Cultural Studies at MUN, the Memorial University of Newfoundland. As an assistant professor, his main topics are youth subcultures, popular culture, marginalized communities, and non-traditional laboring. And one of his students remarked in a review of John BODNER's class, "He is so kind and sweet, but he grades so hard." Okay, at the moment though, he researches conspiracy theories and contemporary legends circulating in and outside the QAnon community. And his latest excellent book, written with some of our fine colleagues, is called COVID-19 Conspiracy Theories, QAnon, 5G, the New World Order, and other viral ideas. Today, John is going to talk about a related matter. Where do contemporary legends fit in? Conspiracy theory and its conglomerate construction. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Theo. That's very kind of you, and please stop reading my students' comments. So thank you very much to the organizers and for everybody's time today in listening to my talk. If there's any digital lag or problem from my end, please flag me. Sometimes I have to move in the house, so so I'll just let the organizer do that. Of course, some of my ideas are just first drafts, so I really look forward to your criticisms and your questions. Thank you. So I'll just share my screen here, and that way you don't just have to look at my face. That is not. My apologies. There we go. So the data for this talk is gathered from publicly accessible or low entry criteria Facebook groups that I joined and monitored from February 2020 until the present day. The criteria for choosing groups was kind of idiosyncratic at first. I joined many American anti-lockdown groups that sprung up in the early days of the pandemic, and I followed some key members from these groups to other groups that seemed significant that they belonged to, basically a digital snowball technique. To expand my research and to test a couple of hypotheses that were being developed, I also joined some Canadian anti-lockdown Facebook groups, anti-government Facebook groups that predated the lockdown. And these groups ended up being transformed by the pandemic and became significant vectors in COVID-19 conspiracy theories. At its height, I was monitoring about 15 groups and collecting for about 3 hours a day. Over time, many of these groups were taken down either by Facebook or by their own moderators as they moved to more friendly sites on the internet. Now, as of this writing, none of my groups survive. Some material was also collected from active group members' personal and publicly accessible Facebook pages. Now, I rarely interacted with these groups, but I might ask a clarifying or provocative question once in a while. Now, these interactions produced some negative responses and some various identity displays, but I was never actually kicked off any pages. Today, I have over 2 gigabytes of primary text and visual media that are spread across thousands of files. And I'm in the very frustrating process, trying to create a searchable database of my research, which can be shared with other researchers. So, in this talk, I'm going to use the conglomerate rock as an operational metaphor. Now, this metaphor allows me to attempt to integrate 3 important questions, I think they're important, you might not, about conspiracy theories and their relationship to contemporary legend. I'm going to try to define and enumerate the constituent elements or texts. I'm going to try to outline a couple of the forces that actually cause this particular structure to emerge. And I'm going to try to outline some of the forces that lead to the dissolution or deconstruction of units back into their constituent parts, and whether or not these are actually discrete or interdependent. I may not have time to get to that. We'll see how it goes. Now, the fluid and seemingly formless nature of conspiracy theories has led researchers to largely give up sometimes on questions of form and structure of the narratives in favor of two other models. The first is what some folks have called conspiracy thinking. Now, at best, this approach suggests a hopefully ethnographically informed epistemological inquiry. And at worst, it's actually an abandonment of core folklore structural and performative projects simply because the primary source material is maddeningly complex. The second approach, adopted recently by some colleagues in Eastern Europe, Madison and Wenzel, and is actually anticipated by gamification hypotheses of those who are studying the QAnon phenomenon, like Rosenberg, is that conspiracy theories are phantic forms of communication that provide sort of truncated little bits of narrative that can only be expanded and understand if you have the code. And to have the code, one must be a participant in a select community of readers and doers. This talk is a kind of rough draft in trying to find a space outside of or between these two strategies by which some people are trying to understand this particular phenomenon. The limits and crisis in my project are kind of fairly obvious, it's very difficult to find a firm link and enough granular data that allows us to trace an individual or group's repertoire, their skill, the performative context, the larger, not mere contextual forces that limit or enable a performed narrative. And of course, it's exceedingly difficult to do all this over and over again diachronically. Although given a proper research design and endless funding and people, I believe we could actually do this, at least for a discrete, smaller set of online data. Now, today my objective is not very grand. I'm just going to use a couple of contemporary legends as discrete units within conspiracy theories to see how they fit, you know, what forces they're subject to, and how we might productively approach some of these things. One more mission that we should begin before I sort of get into this is, you know, I don't really have time in this talk to outline what we might think of as the communicative ecology and tactics within the Facebook ecosystem. But, you know, the program is widely, you know, studied, and it's actually fairly stable during the pandemic. So let's just take a couple of things as just broadly known. You know, it's asynchronic communication, but dialogic. It can sustain multiple forms of multimedia storytelling, as well as allow quick construction of repertoires through the process of downloading posts and their constituent elements like videos and memes and everything. Okay, so let's take a quick look at, say, some of the doctors in the pandemic. Now, this video, I'm not going to play the video. I've got just a little thing on the side. I hope I've left the slide up long enough for folks to take a look at it. This video was incredibly popular in the early days of the pandemic, popping up on almost all of my Facebook groups I was following, and it continues to circulate and is hosted in various places on the internet today. Now, while billed as a doctor and wearing scrubs or scrub-like things, this is a chiropractor. And what the viewer gets is a digestible summation over the kind of 20 some odd minutes, digestible summation of the pandemic's early conspiracy theories. I'll just run through a few of them. That COVID's not a pandemic. It's not real and likely cover for something nefarious, usually having to do with the pharmaceutical and medical industry. On the transcript on the side, you can see the rumor legend of a purposefully misdiagnosed dead infant as well. There's also the traditional call to action and the presentation of the speaker as a brave and imperiled voice of freedom and truth. Now, all of this is common conspiracy narrative material within alternative health communities and anti-vax communities, of which the School of Chiropractic Medicine, some schools within chiropractic medicine are active. Now, I'm going to just take a minute to trace out the relationship between the video testament, legend, and conspiracy theory. So this is just up. You can take a look at it. The author of this video is engaged in a first-person communicative act that is performed and captured within various competencies and esoteric aesthetics, which is a fancy way of saying that the genre of YouTube testimonials. Now we could trace the genealogy of this if we had time, which we don't, but we can follow Saussure and say Roland Barthes, and we can label this particular aesthetic as a kind of first order of a performance. Now here we can see the material culture system of authority, in the medical regalia that our chiropractor is wearing. We can also see the performance of authenticity, by which I mean that the filming aesthetic, you see it's down low, probably on his phone. If we were to watch the video, it's a little bit shaky, So the filming aesthetic denotes an amateur creation, and thus is supposed to create a kind of sense of honesty, earnestness, and a lack of contrivance, which stands in contrast to the aesthetic opposite found in professionally produced videos in mainstream media. The medium itself tells us that this event and performance is not, in fact, mediated, or fabricated, but is rather a form of intimate folk communication that replicates the affect, if not the effect, of face-to-face communication. Here I'm thinking Michael Coven's work on the aesthetic and folklorismus of television ghost hunting shows. It would be important for a further analysis. Peppered throughout the full video are several performances of rumor legends. Now these, like all contemporary legend, function as non-fictional news in and of themselves. But within the larger storytelling frame, they also work rhetorically as proofs, which support an overall thesis and the subsequent layers of an argument. Now, at this point, none of these observations are surprising or maybe even interesting to any of you, but it's what happens at the second order of performance that I think tells us something about the relationship between contemporary legend and conspiracy theory. The second order of the performance is the quoting of the video. Now, here's some finer points on the various modes of parody can be addressed, but we don't have time to do that. Let's just pretend I've made a very compelling case. This quoting is, because of the techno-communicative ecology of Facebook, obviously different from traditional oral transmissions, but I'll highlight a few important ones to discuss. So Lynn S. McNeil, talking about disinformation, notes how links function within legend, spreading legends online and linking, hyperlinking, as a marker of authority, a kind of buttress to truth claims, what I would call a kind of shadow proof. Like our academic, they're very much like our academic parenthetical citations, which are meant to make us feel secure in the argument that we're reading. I mean, in fact, we're often so secure that we rarely bother to actually look up the source and double check the work. In the case of Facebook legend retellings, the video as a whole slips out of the order of things that we think of as content, what's in the video, and the entirety becomes a kind of rhetorical device, a thing which is proof, a secondary source. And thus it sort of becomes a form of tertiary order of signification. If we return to the video as content, though, quoting the video by reposting, an individual sees the video, downloads it, reposts it, right? This becomes an act as a kind of ambiguous re-performance of the legend itself. The communication ecology of Facebook appears permanent insofar as one can search and retrieve anything on an active group. However, the folk experience of participating in larger active groups is one of things constantly disappearing, constantly being buried by new posts. And so, as in oral communication, if you want to keep an argument or an item that's important to you alive or active, you are constantly reposting and essentially re-performing. Now, in the act of re-performing or quoting, The poster has a number of strategies. For example, this giant thing here, but just basically just the top of it. You could put a gloss on the link or the embedded content and somehow claim the content as one's own, as S does on this particular common conspiracy theory, as well as misinformation post here. Other strategies by posters are to write that they believe or support a person, right, that they are quoting or reposting, or alternately, they sometimes create ambivalence or distance in their posts. And we see this in contemporary legend scholarship. And this slippery relationship is actually very important to Facebook posters because it allows them to divert and minimize potentially negative consequences to their posts later on. Oh, we're going to get to these crowd in a minute. Lastly, outside of the more skilled and engaged members of these communities who can edit and modify content, we as researchers don't really know what's important inside of these quoted or reposts to individuals who are part of these groups. So obviously, one of the things that we need to do is to try to engage people to identify how people, the folk or the people consuming conspiracy theories and passing on legend, how people are reading them. What are the hooks? What are the discrete items inside of them that they're responding to? But that's a little outside of my project. So contemporary legends are not simply used argumentatively or as proof of a conspiracy, but are actually discrete utterances of specific subjects. So for example, the evil doctor, the murdered children, Satanists, Antifa, etc. Now, these may be preferentially appeal to one audience, but not to another. For example, it's clear that stories about imperiled children are key to engagement by one audience, an audience that might not actually be brought into QAnon's wider orbit through, say, musings about the deep state or the New World Order or the Illuminati, but might latch onto contemporary legends about imperiled children, and that might be their entry. And a lot of researchers on QAnon have found this. I actually think that the field of neuroscience can actually help us somewhat here, specifically the concept of cognitive load or mental labor. Constructing, maintaining, and transmitting full conspiracy theories is really labor intensive. Contemporary legends, on the other hand, tend to be small and satisfying narratives. Now, if we combine this observation with the fact that contemporary legends and rumors tend to be accretive processes, accretive because legends as debates about belief produce more legends to create a comparative analysis, a kind of folk theory, and analytical processes, and that legend is a subject-based conversational narrative, mean that legends create clusters of similar legends around themselves, producing denser and denser units of meaning, but that the totality, the obligation of constructing this is not borne by any one person. Does this hypothesis suggest that conspiracy theories are merely clusters of rumor legends, contemporary legends? No, I don't think so. No one element of the force and units within conspiracy theories is the praxis of, sorry, I misstated my point. One element in the force and the units within conspiracy theories is that the praxis and narrative form and content of legends, are actually combined with the kind of techno-ecology of the online and offline communicative environment. And so we kind of have a kind of structural parameters with we can build more complex hypotheses and research tools about how discrete units are sort of fused into the larger conspiracies. Before we leave doctors, these kind of benevolent doctors who are communicating to conspiracy theories and perpetuating contemporary legends to others, I've got a couple of more examples of these guys. The benevolent doctor type and the motif. Here we find like the brave insider, risking everything to tell the truth, the whistleblower, the rugged individualist, the renegade, the truther. These are the kinds of positive occupational and larger conspiracy identity theories that are formed in these groups. Now, the figure actually finds its closest antecedents to America's fetishized individualism, most famously formulated in the frontier myth, and its various popular culture ideologies that currently perpetuate it domestically and internationally. Now, depicted on this slide is the infamous America's frontline doctors, who appeared on the Supreme Court steps in July of 2020, and they've continued to be the fountainhead of various alternative medicine and conspiracy theories. Now, superficially, they're basically just a political disinformation campaign loosely aligned with groups like the Tea Party Patriots and the Save Our Country Coalition, all of which are funded by dark money, which invariably supports or supported former President Donald Trump. In the Canadian context, we have Nurses Against Lockdowns, which rebranded as Canadian Frontline Nurses. The original 5 founding members have all had their nursing licenses suspended, for 2 of whom were suspended for attending and speaking at an anti-government rally of the quote formal global frontline nurses in Washington the day before the insurrection of January 6, 2020. This particular group in Canada was instrumental in organizing national protests in early September of 2021 that targeted hospitals. And I'll talk about this a bit more below. Sarah here has framed her fight as a personal awakening and adopted some of the American-derived ideological individual heroism narratives. But like many COVID skeptic nurses, her discourse is more closely aligned with anti-vax and alternative medicine traditions, now, which is outside the scope of this brief talk. When we are analyzing real doctors and nurses operating within conspiracy-informed protest movements, their use of legend, rumor, and narrative is presented as part of their own experiences, research, practices, and life story. Now, within this complex discourse, the literature on contemporary legend does not serve us well, but older research on legend concerning the memorat and the fabulat may. Since personal experiences like the supposed witnessing of false COVID certificates being signed or the murder of COVID patients in hospitals become fabulats as they're reshaped as polished pieces of performance that conform to listeners and generic conventions, or are retellings of first-person accounts 3 or 4 transmission points away from the original. Conversely, also, there occurs conversions from fabulats into memorats as individuals tell secondhand stories as first-person accounts. Now, some researchers without folklore backgrounds point to this process as mis- or disinformation rather than traditional tactics in the relationship between legend and believability. There may need to be some sort of reckoning between common folk practices that emerge within protest movements and what folks are calling strategic conspiracy narratives. Or to put it another way, perhaps all disinformation is simply the professionalization of mundane folk practices, as opposed to the current and common counter-argument that pandemic protesters are learning their craft from the professionals. Now, obviously, I'm running a little short of time and possibly your patience, but I want to briefly sketch out a few of the narratives around malevolent doctors within this tradition and their expression in the Film Your Hospital and General Hospital contemporary legends and larger conspiracy cycle clusters around the institution. As Gillian Bennett and others have pointed out, hospitals are ideal for supernatural legend, contemporary legend, rumor, and other genres. Using Irving Goffman's phrase, they exist as total institutions, which are impermeable to regular citizens contain their own occupational subcultures, power over our bodies, lives, and rights. In my data set, hospital skepticism began early in the pandemic in America. The most common form was that hospitals were profiting from COVID-19, and that's why they were faking the number of patients. This conspiracy doesn't make any sense in the Canadian context, since we have socialized or single-payer healthcare, where profit isn't a motive. It would take at least 6 months for a generalized conspiracy to be morphed and transformed into one in which hospitals are actually part of a massive government and global conspiracy undermining basic human rights and leading to a worldwide slave state, for it to actually make sense in the Canadian context and then to get brought into Canada and lead to the kind of antisocial protest against hospitals and their staff. It's within this context that we get the narratives about and character of the evil doctor and/or the evil or frivolous nurse. The frivolous addition to nurse is because of the gendered attack on nurses that use their TikTok dance routines against them, and the basic sexist and misogynistic charge that women's activities, including being professionals saving lives, are somehow generously frivolous. On Monday, September 13th, 2021, Canada's frontline nurses, along with a number of others, supported national protests against COVID restrictions were held, and people remarkably gathered in front of hospitals. The protests ranged from the tiny to the quite large. The larger ones were in areas traditionally with anti-government and anti-vax large communities. These protests were anticipated actually by, as I said, a steady rise in hospital protests since the late summer of 2020. Despite the relative success of the event on the day, there was an immense national backlash. It was quite overwhelming, and it appears that the loose coalition of organizers was fractured, and they've not yet reappeared on the national scene at the time of this writing. So now, why hospitals? You know, asking why hospitals sort of presents us with another chance to see the conglomerate nature of conspiracy theories. As I noted above, powerful total institutions will generate contemporary legends to articulate asymmetrical power relations. Accompanying this fact is that all CTs blame the world's problems on a hive of opaque and powerful nefarious actors. And the hospital is a perfect setting. Perfect because, while the New World Order narratives are good and appealing, it's very hard to find the secret lair of the Illuminati. And getting to Davos is expensive, while your local hospital is right down the road. Following the various protests, various media figures have actually asked why these groups didn't just protest the government legislatures. Well, firstly, the location of legislatures are again in Canada quite far away. And even your local member of parliament is usually located in just a featureless office block. There's nothing important about the building. Hospitals then become iconic buildings in this tradition. Basically, hospital buildings are the material culture equivalent of Jeannie Thomas's observation that conspiracy theories are populated with celebrity villains like Bill Gates or Oprah. Hospital buildings are celebrity buildings. Combine these two structural dynamics with a corpus of tales that include historic crimes like, say, forced sterilization, unauthorized human experiments, and in the case of the Montreal experiment of the 1950s and 60s, which involved actual mind control experiments by Dr. Ewan Cameron and McGill's Allen Memorial Institute, which was under the auspices of the CIA's MK Ultra program. And we have a healthy collection of historic and contemporary material with which to cast hospitals as dangerous geographies. In addition, the attack on hospitals demonstrates that conspiracy-informed anti-public health protests are not what we might think of as normal political movements following the basic trajectory of the sociology of social movements, especially in the 20th century. Rather, this is a populist movement that is adopted or being co-opted by extreme right-wing groups with proto-fascist underpinnings, which can be seen in their emphasis which this hypothesis can be defended in these groups' emphasis on direct action, street fighting, intimate intimidation, and the attack on zones of knowledge production, of which the hospital and her researchers and workers are a key site. These attacks are made possible by particular structural and enacted relationships of power, as well as the weaponization of conspiracy theories and legends into a politically violent form of ostension that has been tutored, through which we have been tutored to identify dangerous enemies and eliminate them. It is here that we wind our way back to, unfortunately, the 1980s, which I myself had to live through once, to the rumor panics in the work of, say, Bill Ellis, Gary Allen Fine, Joe Best, and Jeffrey Victor, among several of my esteemed European colleagues. We might think of the rumor panic as a kind of folk or vernacular political expression, a tendency in those inspired by, say, the Birmingham School. But at this point, I'm not certain that the distinction between orchestrated political violence by powerful social actors and a kind of lumpen political ostension performed through violence and intimidation isn't a kind of intellectual dead end or cul-de-sac. Now, scholars of contemporary theory, conspiracy theory, contemporary legend theory, have tended to emphasize one element of the phenomenon over another. Let's say history, historians, politics, rhetoric, semiotics, epistemology. And here I think folklore offers the possibility of an integrated and hybrid approach. But really, it cannot yet do so unless we also begin to think seriously about a kind of folklorically informed political science, which I think is the last element in coming to a deeper understanding of the forces that actually shape and bind these conglomerate units together. And as I said, these are preliminary thoughts. I thank you for criticisms of them and for your questions, and certainly for your time and invitation today.
Well, thanks a lot, John. Very interesting again. There was one remark about from Greg and Ben as well about yeah, if you are following 15 anti-lockdown, anti-government Facebook groups, what will this do to your timeline and to your other social media and websites that will be showing more of this this stuff? And one other question that I have concerning this is, when you are investigating these kind of narratives and these conspiracy theories, don't you get fed up sometimes? I mean, of course, it's your job, and you should look at it from with a neutral gaze. But on the other hand, you are a person with certain convictions, and don't you get sometimes very tired of all these lies and conspiracies and accusations, etc.?
Yeah, okay. I'll move from the professional to the personal. So I admit that I'm very jealous of Tim Tangerlini and his crew of data scientists, because I had to cut and paste and curate this material. So I think my data set is not quite as convincing as Tim's, although I would argue it's richer and more detailed. Actually, I'm not arguing with Tim. He's got me beat. But yeah, it's very labor intensive. And I think the one advantage of it is that you get to see things developing and moving slowly, right? You get to see this kind of process in which on Monday, some things show up on a page and you watch them slowly emerge or fall away, which is a little bit like being able to watch folk processes. So that's been a very good tutoring tool to me, to try to see how this works. As Theo has implied, it has done no good to my mental health. and it is quite exhausting. And I think every once in a while, I have not been the best version of a objective researcher. But I think that we should all admit that sometimes when we do this work, it does affect us. I think that we've seen some very good studies of fieldwork practices, and I think we should all be kind to ourselves when we're doing this kind of work.
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks. There is another question remark by Matthew, which is rather long. Maybe Matthew, you would repose your question here live.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to put it in this way. I was just wondering, you were saying that there are some material origins to some of these conspiracy theories, and also the kind of integrating part of these conspiracy theories later into these circulations are also interesting. But I was just wondering whether there are certain institutional transformations like privatizations, like the inaccessibilities, which adds on to the unintended strengths that some of these conspiracy legends or narratives attain. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Yeah, I think that well, as many people before me have noted, that when we create institutions which increase marginalization or decrease people's ability to exercise power and control over the processes that they're being put through. For example, in a hospital, biomedical processes, that we increase the context of legend and legendary as well as conspiracy theories in order to comment on these asymmetrical power relations. And I think that if we build institutions which let's say you mentioned, Matthew, privatization, if we create institutions which value capitalist exploitation of the maximum amount of profit through the minimal services to people, well, that would be one of these forces that I'm talking about, which leads to the kind of conglomeration and the potential utilization. These are these kinds of socio-economic, basic Foucault power relationships. And I think if we had some clever folklore mathematicians, perhaps we could come up with an equation which we could test. That would be my ideal fantasy world, but I'm not that smart. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, John. Especially that conglomerate paradigm is very interesting now when you explain. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will be going into some violent ostension in a minute. Of the three speakers today,